I'm here interviewing Shmuel Simenowitz.
He's only drinking water.
Who's only drinking water.
That's gotta know you.
The one kosher product on the premises. If you could start out, I'd like to hear family history, family background. I'm particularly interested in this Connecticut farming branch that you were telling me about the other day.
I grew up in East Meadow, Long Island. It's kind of ironic that I ended up living in East Longmeadow, Massachusetts. I guess I didn't get very far. On my father's side, his uncles and father and much of that side of the family, when they came to this country, ended up in I guess it's the northeast corner of Connecticut, the Norwich, Lebanon area. And we used to spend our summers up there. We used to actually stay in this place called Lebanon Lodge. I guess it's in Lebanon. And I remember very clearly my father's uncle Milty had a farm up there, and for me that was the big thrill of my childhood. Uncle Milty was a chicken farmer, and he had a few head of milking cow, and it was just really ingrained into the family. I have photos of my grandfather, who was I never met him. He had died when my father was young. But apparently he was a lawyer and a great horseman. I mean, I have photos of him riding, and you can just see he was really at home in the saddle. My dad also was an attorney and a horseman. And I guess I followed the family history. I was a horseman, and we rode before we could walk.
This is growing up?
Growing up in Long Island. There was always Sundays going riding, and Dad used to pick us up even at yeshiva and take us to the riding stable. So even when I went to yeshiva high school up in Washington Heights, my dad a lot of times would meet me Sundays. We'd go riding up in Van Cortlandt Park. So we were fairly proficient in horses, and once again, following the family tradition, I did go to law school, practiced law for many years. But as I got more involved with NOFA and sustainable living, and probably as a result of my exposure to certain music clients, I worked in the entertainment industry as an attorney, and I worked with artists like the band, which had a decidedly rural bent to them, and our own suburban bordering on rural lifestyle. At some point we decided to leave Long Island and move back up to New England. We bought a farm in Vermont.
And when you say we, you mean you?
At this point I was married. Yep. I had children, and we packed up and went to a farm in Vermont. Now, it was not a Green Acres type of experience where we were living in New York City, never had seen a pitchfork before. I mean, basically, we had our entire infrastructure on the island. We had horses and dogs and a flock of laying hens, and we just really moved them to a place more suitable. So people think, we made this transition from Wall Street to the woods. We were living, as I said, a suburban bordering on a rural lifestyle, even out there. I may have been practicing law, but we were saving rainwater. But at some point, the saving rainwater side won over the law side. And I didn't really give up law entirely. I just reevaluated. It's like we say in the horse world, either you drive the horse or the horse drives you. And I kind of used that analysis on my whole life. And, one of the propelling reasons that got us off the island is I found I didn't own my law practice, it owned me. So ultimately, after tinkering a few years, I came back to it, but in such a way that I owned it and it didn't control me.
Mm-hmm. Going back a little bit to when you were doing the equestrian stuff while you were at Yeshiva High School, were you the only kid at Yeshiva High School who was, whose dad would take him riding, or was that?
Probably. I mean, Yeshiva did not have the equestrian team, let's put it that way. We joke around and say, and I'm the president of the Jewish Chainsaw Owners Club. I remember my brother came in from Israel once, and he saw a plastic case in my garage. He says, "What's that?" I says, "My chainsaw." And he said, "Jews don't have chainsaws." And that was actually one of the titles I was thinking for a book I was going to write. Another was very similar. I had a position as an adjunct rabbi in Rosedale, Queens for many years. And I bought a horse property out in Suffolk County. And the rabbi says, "Why are you living out there?" I said, "We have horses." And he said, "Jews don't have horses." He says, "Imagine Tevye, the guy 14 hours a day, drove a milk wagon, breaking his back. When he came home, what did he do? Go horseback riding?" So, there was some of that perception. But then again, when it's really because horses represent more of a rural thing. You can't keep horses really in the city. Although I used to ride in Central Park when I went to yeshiva, and I grew up. My dad was a riding instructor in Prospect Park. I remember there was a bridle path on Ocean Parkway as a kid. And I used to ride with my dad as a kid in the park. But so the Jew in a more urban setting has more trouble visualizing it. Suburban and rural, it's much more natural. When's the last time you were on the road and you saw either someone riding a horse or someone driving a horse-drawn vehicle? So I guess, sure, in yeshiva, I was sort of more of the odd man out, which is why ultimately when we got to Vermont, you're driving a team, 2-3 horses on the road, and no one would look twice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you know about your family, before they came to, you grew up in the New York area. Where did your family come from in Europe? Do you know anything about that?
Different parts. My mother's family came from Russia, and my grandmother, I believe, was born in Russia, stopped in South Africa when she was like 1 or 2, and then ultimately moved here. All my grandparents were born in this country. On my father's side, the family came from Belarus. Some of them came from a shtetl called Ivya, which is southeast of Vilna. And I guess it's the main person who came out of Ivya was Rav Chaim Ozer Grodzinski, who was the leader of European Jewry right before the Holocaust. It's very interesting. On one hand, it's between Liadi, where the first Lubavitcher Rebbe came from, and on the other side, there's Panovich, which was the great Misnagid seat. So, in a sense, I look at my own life, and I kind of straddle both of those worlds. So it's not, entirely surprising. The ones who came here came early on in the late 1800s in that wave. The ones who stayed, unfortunately, did not survive. And as a matter of fact, one of the things we're doing now is we're building a sugar house, and the design of the sugar house is incorporating some of the elements that the synagogue in Ivya that was destroyed by the Nazis has. The history of the community was chronicled very carefully by the survivors, in Israel, as was the custom. And we want to perpetuate their memory. I actually have a picture, it's my computer screensaver, of, the Talmud class and Rabbi Shatzkis, who was the Lumja Rav, giving the shiur, and I knew one of my relatives was in the picture. He ran the candy factory in the town. His name was Moshe Fisilovsky. And then I look at the caption of the picture, and I see that my great-grandfather was also in the picture, and I never knew that.
The reason I ask is just general curiosity, but I've been finding that in some cases people who have some rural connection here will say that, the reason our families went into farming here was because that's what they knew from the shtetl.
Well, he was a cattle trader.
Okay.
So there it is.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we started raising cattle in Vermont. And we had Scotch Highland cattle. You ever see them? The fuzzy, red cattle with the long horns? And sure enough, one day, one of my young steers whose horn was longer than my arm when I went to feed him an apple, kind of swiped me. And I was grazed slightly, but I came home, I was all thrilled. And my wife said, why are you happy? I said, as a kid, you learn in the Talmud, if an ox gores a cow and everything. I said, finally, here I am, 40 years old. I actually got gored by an ox. Who else in Yeshiva University actually got gored by an ox? It was a watershed moment.
So we can move forward now to when you came to Vermont. Describe the the homestead that you set up. I mean, initially, what were you doing there?
Well, we went up with an open mind. Where a lot of people fail is they go up with a preconceived notion of what they're going to do, and then they find that they're fighting the elements to make it happen. I found unless you're a salmon spawning, it's usually easier to float downstream. So we ended up through quite miraculous means with a homestead that sort of pre-revolutionary. The house was built in 1780. And it had an incredible stand of mature maples. So in my mind, I start thinking maples, horses, maple sugaring. And we got the maple bug. Someone lent us a little pan. And we took a drill and we put in about 15 taps. And we boiled it in the house on the wood stove. And all the wallpaper started peeling off. And we steamed out the house. And I remember we were sitting there in our gatkis. It got so hot in the room because we had the wood fire absolutely cranked to boil this down. And what did we make? A cupful or two? But that was it. We were hooked. Next year it's 125 taps, then 250, and we've really never looked back. A sugar house and a bigger sugar house, now an even, more elaborate setup. So it was there. It suggests that, it's the Dubner Maggid once said it's always easier to, in a sense, paint the target and then, shoot the hole and paint the target around it. It's easier to hit a bullseye that way. We came to a mature sugar maple stand. Made sense to go into sugaring, as opposed to, bulldozing everything and growing corn.
Was there a particular reason you chose Vermont, or you chose that particular part of Vermont?
My wife had spent a lot of time in Vermont as a kid. Her family owns a house up in Windham, which is maybe 35 minutes from Reedsboro. We knew we wanted to get out of Long Island. We were getting killed there financially, although we were making a boatload of money. I was a successful attorney. My wife was a corporate executive, second to the CEO in a big veterinary pharmaceutical company. And thank God we were making a lot of money, but it was going out just as fast. I mean, one of the watershed moments in our life, we came home one day and there were 7 cars in the driveway. There was the stable hand, there was the nanny, there was the house cleaner, there was the landscape guy, there was a paralegal, there was an associate. We couldn't get into our own driveway. And we said, we're not that important that we need a staff. And I think that really spurred us to reevaluate a whole lot of things and adopt a getting by on less kind of philosophy. And suburban Long Island was really not the place to be doing that. So, we kind of loaded everything we had in the horse trailer and went to a place. I had been working draft horses on the property in Long Island. So we just went to a place where it was more appropriate to do.
You mentioned some connection with NOFA, the organic farm. Was that something that you'd gotten into even before you came up here?
Years before.
Uh-huh.
I used to come annually to their conference in Hampshire College.
And what brought you in there? Was it the interest of draft horses, or?
It was everything. It was, I always had a nagging kind of roots back to the land desire deep down. Much of Judaism and Torah is really agricultural. People tend to miss that point. They get so caught up sometimes in minutiae, they don't realize much of it. 50 years ago, 70 years ago, everybody had chickens. Today it's a novelty if a person has a chicken. It was just not that uncommon. Ask your grandparents. They used to bring live fish home, figure filter fish. Their parents, in those days, all the wagons were pulled by the horses. This, radical technological explosion is really 1.5 generations old. It's not that this is all ancient history. There are people today, many people's grandmothers know how to pluck a chicken. Today, obviously, we've had this huge swoop of agribusiness, and it's disconnected people from that. One of our reasons for leaving was to be involved in the reconnection, which, an idea which has its roots in Hasidic philosophy as well. Part of, one of the essential philosophies of Hasidus is that we're connected to godliness, kind of like by two air hoses. One, we draw down godliness from heaven, and two, it's our job to take all the stuff on earth and plumb its depths for the godliness within, kind of send it back up. Mm-hmm. So like a scuba diver with an air hose, and the worst thing that can happen to the scuba diver is, someone steps on the hose or cuts it, right? Or, you're out on a spacewalk connected to the capsule by that hose. If your air hose gets cut. So society is also on a lot of life support. And these hoses all get cut. Today, the office places, I don't want to go into the whole corporate America thing, but there's certainly, by design, a movement to wean people away from a link with nature. You go into the supermarket or a casino, you don't know if it's day or night. In an office, there are no windows. All these things really put people into an artificial place. Part of what we were trying to do was bring out a more natural one, which was just the way it always was.
Do you find yourself having to translate this sort of connection not just to, in particular to, Hasidim who are more urban-based? I mean, because I assume that would be something that they would get, but they're not living it the way you are. So, how does that work?
That's a good question. They are all, we're stereotyping now, but they're crowded, they're stacked up a mile high over Newark, in Williamsburg and Brooklyn and this and that. But it's really in their DNA. They sit around every Shabbos and every night telling stories about the Baal Shem Tov, taking a wagon ride through the forest and going, wagonless Hasidim, going to see their Rabbi. And they very much appreciate what we're doing. Whenever we have a chance and we have some Bachrim come up to the farm, and we'll take a wagon load of them in Fabring, they walk away absolutely transformed because it's in their DNA as Hasidim, and it just kind of lays in there inchoate. And we get to actually animate a part of their lives that's been in there and never really been inflated before. So you get some guy's going to go out and become a shliach somewhere and tell the story about a Baal Shem Tov traveling in a wagon, and he'll spend an afternoon with us, and we'll go through the woods in a wagon, bouncing and telling stories and everything. And when he goes out and tells that story, he's not just telling it from his mind, he's telling it from the essence of his being, because now he feels the bumps of the road and everything. It's a very different way. So they readily connect in principle with what we're doing. What they are understandably maybe reluctant is looking at, there's a whole political spectrum of, who the environmentalists are today, and much of it is from the non-Torah world. But once they, understand who we are, they're comfortable with what we're doing.
When you mentioned, and I think I've seen somewhere else, this idea, which makes perfect sense, that the Torah is sort of an agricultural text. Can you give some? I can think of one example that everybody knows about, which is the corners of the field. But there must be. We're talking large scale. What comes to mind for you when if somebody asks you, well, what do you mean by that the Torah is an agricultural text?
Well, for example, Shabbos. The laws of Shabbos are 70% agricultural. People think it's just turning on a light. It really starts from all the acts which were done in pursuit of the construction of the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness. So it involved plowing and planting and harvesting and reaping and winnowing and threshing. All the acts involved in either, baking bread or growing herbs from which they made dye to dye the wool. But you tell a kid about plowing or walking, running on the grass, and that you might pluck out the grass of this. If they've never seen what a field looks like and a plow looks like, they don't appreciate the whole dynamic of this cycle. Dealing with animals. I mean, so much of Shabbos, once again, 100 years ago, people had animals. So what do you do if your animal is sick on Shabbos? So people who live that way, these are common occurrences. But every kid who studied Talmud, learned about that. If your bull got out and damaged the neighbor's property, and, to them, or chasing away a bird before taking the eggs, I'd say the majority of it is really has some base in an agricultural pursuit. Certainly, the Shemitah year or the laws involving leaving the fields for the poor are obvious ones. But, it goes beyond that, a lot of them. Most certainly the Sabbath laws. And a lot of them leaving harvest for, I'm thinking how to translate this. Not using produce the first, second, third years, consecrating the fourth year. All the natural cycles. And by the way, all the holidays themselves were really agricultural celebrations. This was the harvest. This was when the spring wheat came in. This was the end of the fall harvest. They were agricultural cycles. This is all of them. But, living in the city, you don't really appreciate, this is a time of the harvest, or, people to some degree sit in the sukkah and they make it more of an agricultural thing. But that's what it was. It was the harvest time. Mm-hmm. Today the big thing is Tu B'Shvat has become the rediscovered, Jewish Earth Day.
Well, as you say this, I'm thinking, there must be, I would imagine there'd be sort of a mass movement on the part of urban Jews to rural areas. Clearly there isn't such a thing, but are you aware of other people who are thinking similarly and
well,
whether they're going to Vermont or someplace else?
It's very interesting. There are two theories of Jewish history. One is called internal causation, the other is called external causation. This is how we look at our histories. People, the internal causation, whatever the Jewish destiny, the Jews brought it on themselves. More of a religious and a traditional philosophy. External causation, Jews are another, bucket in the wind, or whatever the mixed metaphor is. A lot of the Hasidic communities now are facing both internal and external realities. They have large demographics. They have, thank God, a lot of children. And the infrastructure of their community is simply not enough to handle it. There are fights in Williamsburg between the hip-hop set and the Hasidim. Although if you look at them, sometimes you can't tell them apart.
And there's that guy, right? There's a Hasidic rapper.
This guy Matis Yahu.
Okay, that's the guy. I don't know very much about him. But
no, but I'm saying the real hipsters, right. The Bohemians, were discovering cheap rent right outside of New York. So Williamsburg is the next Tribeca or artsy, trendy area, and what it's doing is it's gentrifying the neighborhood, and the communities can't expand to meet the growing population. So they are actively pursuing leaving. The problem is, it's kind of all or none. Jewish life, by definition, is communal. I once heard a famous Jewish historian named Baron, Salo Baron, speak. And he said, other than the forced overcrowding, the ghetto is actually a very useful place for the Jew. It met all its communal needs. A Jew needs to daven with a minyan. A Jew needs a Hebrew school, a cheder. Before refrigeration, if you shechted a cow, it's nice if there's 50 people who will buy the whole thing, right? One guy can't shecht the cow for a hamburger. So the ghetto, in a sense, Jews living together, performed tremendous, communal needs. It says with the Enlightenment, the ghetto walls came crumbling down, and the Jews, blindly ran into the Enlightenment. And he asked the question. He says, and today we're still asking ourselves, was it worth the price? So it's not that one Jew can just launch himself, in the middle of Podunk, Maine, and say, I have arrived. There are legitimate halachic and communal needs. A Jew wants to daven with a minyan.
So, and that goes towards explaining why you have since moved to East Longmeadow here, right?
Correct.
Right.
We made certain cost-benefit analyses, as well as, a lot of soul-searching on our own journey, that certain things were more important to how we raised our children. Daily identification and involvement in Jewish institutions. My kids go to shul in the morning. There's a yeshiva across the street. Those are important. It would be nice if there was a utopian Jewish society. There have been efforts to have one, or there have been efforts to have a lot of them. They haven't always panned out. But certainly the Hasidic communities are exploring huge acquisitions, where they're talking thousands of housing units down in the Pennsylvania area. They need to be within commuting distance of Manhattan, but they're simply being driven out of the city by the real estate realities. So that, the people want to leave. They don't want to leave their institutions behind, but with certain exceptions, most of them are portable. They can take them, up in the Catskills. There are now several year-round Jewish communities. We're just transplants, starting with Monroe and Kiryas Yoel, and all the way up. There's a new Satmar community. Vishnitz has a year-round community now in Kayamisha, and they're doing that. But you move 100, 200, 300 people. They just opened up a Jewish yeshiva in, Waterbury, Connecticut, and boom, 100 people, just an instant Jewish community. I predict there will be more of that because the middle-class Jews are really getting pushed out economically, and a lot of them are saying, they're also competing with other things for tuition dollars. So people are going to look at some of these older cities towards New England, which have infrastructures, and hopefully rehabilitate them. The infrastructures are there.
Yeah. All right. When you any number of small farming tasks and enterprises that you go through, what makes how you do those things? For example, making maple syrup. What kinds of things do you do to sanctify those activities so that you're not just, like your neighbor tapping his maple sugars, maple trees? Is there anything that you do that's different that ties it back to the Torah?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about, an example of one or two of those things.
All right.
Whether it's animal husbandry, maple sugaring.
No, a friend came up with we had a plow day. And people come with their horses, and we hitch up different rigs, and we plow the field. It's an old New England, what they call a threshing circle. We all go down, plow, his field, and then we go plow his field, and then, it's called a threshing circle. And someone came up to our farm. They brought a mule, and they were going to throw him on the conga line with the horses. And I says, you can't. It says in the Torah, you can't work the different animals together. Certainly in our maple syrup production, the fact is, it's really, you're the English teacher, is it prescribed or proscribed?
Proscribed would be prohibited. Prescribed would be, called for. So.
All right, well, we really have to follow the dictates, for example, Shabbos. We don't sugar on Shabbos. Our horses are not allowed to work on Shabbos either. Animals can't work either. Obviously, the defoamers we use have to be kosher. We have Passover certification. So as an added restriction, we never bring bread in the sugar house. And it's, challenging when you're up all night sugaring and, the wife wants to send up a couple of sandwiches and everything. So minimally, those are some of the things. We had a minor miracle happen. One year we had a big sap run right before Pesach. As you know, sugaring season often runs right into Passover. And all the buckets were overflowing. All my friends came up, helped us collect. And then we went right to the Seder. And all the sap got ruined over Pesach. It spoiled because it was the end of the season.
Boil it in time.
We couldn't boil on Yontif. We lost quite a bit. And somebody passed the comment, like, gee, your God really, helped you. Some derogatory comment. And I said to them, look, you don't get hurt doing the right thing. And about a half year later, I got a call from the Vermont Department of Agriculture asking if we were still doing an adopt-a-tree program we had started. And I said we were. And it turns out they had gotten a call from Oprah Winfrey Magazine. And they were looking to do a little sidebar story on an adopt-a-tree because they were doing a whole feature on maple. And they did recipes and stories and a little sidebar, adopt your own maple tree. And sure enough, they vetted us out over a few months and did a little story that ran on the last page. And the response was just thunderous. All over America, all of Oprah's fans, thank God, wanted to adopt a tree on our farm. So ultimately, when we went to ship the syrup, the back of the pickup was loaded with boxes. And I went and I saw the guy who had passed the comment, And I said to him, see, you don't get hurt. So, it's a perfect example. If it's a question of sugaring or Yontif, there's no contest. Yontif always wins. So, and there's a certain attitude. We're not getting rich making maple syrup. To us, the maple syrup is actually a metaphor of life. What is maple syrup? You take sap and you boil out 98% of it and you leave the essence. What is life? The same thing. Boil away the 90% of the superfluous stuff. And what's left is really the essence. So it's an excuse for us to, teach all the skills of sustainable living and our version of, Torah through sustainable living. So there's a real, I hate the expression, God consciousness to our sugaring. We're not just making a food. Also, we had a poultry, so we had eggs. And the name of the egg company was the Heavenly Yolk. And our little trademark was we had Oricana hens. And they laid blue eggs. So in each dozen, we would have one of the blue eggs with the brown and white. And we used to paint the yarmulke on the blue egg. And on the box, it says, you have a cousin in every dozen. And it turns out that we made, because what we do a lot of is teaching programs and educational programs. So the mascot of the farm is a little Jewish blue egg named Shelley Bloom. So, the eggs were not an end in themselves. They were delicious eggs, make no mistake. But they were really there to provoke a dialogue towards, the things that we wanted to get across. So everything, when we're feeding the hens or doing anything, it's all, there's an always awareness. There's that, it is for a higher cause.
I imagine, just from my own personal experience, doing much smaller endeavors than yours, but living in this area for, almost 20 years now, you must have forged or still be in the process of forging relationships with neighbors, non-Jewish neighbors, needless to say. What's that been like, and particularly as it's affected your farming? have you gotten to know other farmers in Reedsboro? And
Oh, sure.
What's that exchange been like?
It's funny because when I came, it's been symbiotic. I bring certain things to the table that they don't have. Everyone up here knows how to make maple syrup, and they can't figure out how to give it away. I knew how to sell it, but I didn't know how to make it. So, hence an exchange was born. So I've learned, everything from, my neighbors and friends. But I've been now giving lectures to the Vermont maple syrup makers at the annual meetings on ag tourism and marketing. That's really, areas which I'm comfortable. So there's been a tremendous exchange.
And what kinds of things can you say that you've learned from them? Practical skills?
How to make maple syrup, everything.
Yeah.
As I said, I wasn't a city guy, but the reason God gave us 2 ears and one mouth is that we should listen twice as much as we speak. And just being out in the woods with loggers and foresters and being around organic farmers, that's how you learn to do it. Teamsters. Mercifully, I was a fairly competent teamster when I got up here, which gave me some credibility. I told you the story with Carol Stowe, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, no,
He went in the general store and he said, I hear there's some lawyer from New York just moved up here, got himself, a team of Percherons. Does he know what he's doing, or are we going to read about him in the paper? And my friend Tom said, well, the guy plowed and disked his fields, got in all this firewood and sugared with them. I suspect he knows what he's doing. So that came in handy and actually brought me some credibility. But it was funny. One guy asked me, he had some overflow work, and I said I would drive for him if ever, but I could never drive, Friday night sundown to Saturday night sundown for Shabbos. And he looked at me and said, not even for $500? And I said, no, not even for $500,000. And he was amazed that, I held to some principle that for $500 I wouldn't go away. I figured if you're going to insult me, at least pick a bigger number, But he meant well. So, no, we've made a lot of friends. I'm not naive. I can't imagine everyone loves me. But I think they're at least civil enough to, if they don't, to keep it to themselves.
Which reminds me, that's kind of the New England way. Civility often is equivalent to keeping it to yourself. One of the things I'm interested in, and really what this book is about, is how a Jewish identity and a New England identity kind of converge. So I'd just like to get your thoughts about, where do you see an overlap between, let's say, small-town New England values or culture and what you're bringing from, more traditional Jewish culture? Is there a convergence?
Well, there is, and I never really thought about it. Maybe I'm snapping from the hip here. But as a Jew and as a New Englander, a rural New Englander, I think you live closer to the vest. And there's more of a reaching hand out for the next guy. Everyone carries chains in their pickups. The roads are icy and the culverts are deep. And, you don't know which end of the tow chain you're going to be on. One day you're in the ditch and you got to wait till a friend tows you out. And the next day he's in the ditch and you're towing them out. And that's kind of a metaphor. Certainly Jews are that way. In the city, you can go your whole life not know your neighbor. In a rural setting, knowing your neighbor may actually keep you alive. So it's a closer to the vest existence. But, even going back to your prior question, by and large, I had, great respect. I think people respect, they're not Jewish, but what we had in common was that we're religious. They're from Americans and from Christians, and we're from Jews. So they respect someone who puts their principles before their pocket. I play some guitar, and we had a neighbor house burned down, and they did a benefit concert to raise money to help them rebuild. A community effort. And they asked me to headline the show. And, they called me up to say that the church choir was performing. Would I be offended? And, I told them no, but it was nice that they called. They thought enough to ask. So I'd have to say there were more nice, considerate things like that than anything. Has it been an idyllic, halcyon paradise? No, but people are decent, I have to say, by and large.
What year did you come into Reedsboro?
Probably about 7-8 years ago.
Uh-huh.
Mid-90s.
So I think I'd be curious just to hear before we finish up.
That's a good question, by the way, about the New England values and the Jewish values.
That's what the book is about. Ultimately, that's what the book is trying to do. So if you don't have an answer,
is dovetail them?
I mean, that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay.
Because what I've written about and researched before is sort of New England culture. That my first book is more about the sort of the Yankee culture, similar oral history.
Well,
This book is doing oral history with Jews in New England, trying to figure out how the two things are.
One thing I've seen, a cultural clash, and I don't know if this works for you, is that there's a tension between New England's fierce individualism and the right to do what you want on your property, and there have been court battles about people whether they wanted to dump or this and that, and they really held their property rights and their personal liberties very near and dear. And then, for example, with the civil unions, and a lot of people's reactions to them, which I just happened to notice, an extraordinary tension between those clashing values. The
value of individualism, the value of tolerance.
Tolerance, and that's right. And individualism's, the Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, "The right to stretch my arm ends where the next guy's nose begins." And people wanting on one hand to be left alone, and on the other hand, a wide societal conformity. We had some neighbors who had a civil union. Now, once a carload of people came down the road screaming obscenities and everything, and we thought it was directed to us. Then we found out it was directed to them, So it was an unusual occurrence, but that tension does exist. People respected us, our individuality, and they respected the fact they knew they couldn't call us on Shabbos. And they said, it's not their religious customs, but there's a family steeped in religious values. They very much, accepted and appreciated that. Matter of fact, when they installed the new postmaster, I was asked to give the opening benediction. I don't think Reedsboro had ever had a rabbi give any benediction at a public function. That was, on one hand, it was an extraordinary progressive moment for them. Our syrup shipping business was probably the number one volume mail out of there, but, it was quite an experience. And they even got kosher food for us. So I have to say, living there full time had been a very positive run.
Howard Cohen was telling me that, I guess it was right after 9/11, that the firehouse in Bennington had him come in as their official chaplain. Similar thing. What I wanted to hear about a little bit was just the current thing, that the building that you're building. I think you told me about it, but I don't think it was on tape. The sugar house.
We're starting construction. By the time this comes up, you may have pictures of it in your book already. We've expanded our sugar house, and this is very consistent with my own involvement in the Jewish environmental movement. There's a big push now towards what's called the greening of sacred space. And the synagogues are, made out of recycled materials and all sorts of feng shui, and you didn't see you can't show the eye roll on the tape, But, that's all fine, and I have nothing against that. My only comment is that I think it doesn't go far enough. It says in the Torah that God says, build me a sanctuary and I will dwell besocham. Besocham means in them. The building is just an excuse for the godliness to come down. The godliness ultimately resides within every person. That's the sacred space. So, in a sense, we're part of this dialogue. Our statement towards sacred space is a sugar house, because it's a place that Jews live and work and spend time and learn Torah and sing and eat and sleep. So it's kind of like a sukkah. Sukkah is the mitzvah that you even bring the mud in your boots on. It's an all-encompassing. Mm-hmm. So we spend a lot of hours in the sugar house. So I thought that would be a good metaphor for saying what's sacred space. Now, fortunately, we've got a guy named Ed Levin doing the design, and it's being actually modeled after the Polish wooden synagogue architecture of the 18th century. You'll notice the roof lines, the gable on the hip, and we want to make a statement that way. And I know there were movements to rebuild these wooden Polish synagogues, but then they find there's no Jews. And personally, I don't really want to be part of an effort to build a museum to the dead Jew. I'm into the museum of the living, working, breathing, sleeping, eating, reproducing Jew. So this is our tribute. It turns out 2 weeks ago, a wooden synagogue outside of Moscow burnt down. And the next building we may do may be a synagogue-type structure of the same wooden log construction. This is going to be timber framed. And it's a teaching project as well. Groups come up while we're doing it and work with us. And people are invested in it. When you sit and you start carving the timbers, and we're going to take some of the trees on site and actually incorporate them into the furniture and the building. Then you first really feel the link with the land and the building. But ultimately, the holiness, comes from within. So that's our take on sacred space.
I think I'm sure you know the temple in Greenfield.
Mm-hmm.
Here, I think that was designed partly with some replication of those Polish synagogues in mind, too.
Little bit.
And it doesn't look...
No, it looks kind of contemporary.
No, there's a leader. There we go.
There we go. Where do you think the Polish synagogues got a lot of their architectural ideas? Some of it came from medieval architecture, and a lot of the Gothic flying buttress type truss design. And a lot of the exterior came from the Far East, as it turns out. So you look at a lot of these synagogues, they almost look like pagodas. Yeah. Absolutely. So it's very interesting. One of the guys, I'm really excited about, one of the guys coming from California to frame with us is a Japanese joinery framer. So some of the joints, we're going to incorporate some of the Japanese joinery in the design. The concept of Japanese joinery is just like Japanese food, that the food should be pleasing to both the eye and to the palate. These are works of art, just the joints themselves. So I'm real excited about that. Personally, learn some Japanese joinery. I've always been a big fan of it. So that's our spin.
Yeah, well, I'll make sure to get up there. Last thing I forgot to ask before, have you had dairy animals at all?
No.
Okay. I was going to ask you, because when I was down at Adama in Connecticut, I remember there was an issue about milking on Shabbat.
Those are our chickens. We started them off.
Oh.
Who you work with, Shamu?
Yeah, I've talked to Shamu, and then I also met
Adam.
Jacob Klein, who was working there also.
All right.
Yeah. But Shamu was the main person. Well, anyway, you've never had issues about what to do with dairy animals on Shabbat.
Well, there is no issue. You either you have a non-Jew milk them, or you milk them
off the ground.
That's right. Once again, it's where they feel the values clash. Like what a waste of milk.
That's what was coming up for them, I think. Yeah.
Well, I never saw that as a conflict. That's what the Torah says, how to do it. I've supervised local milkings up here for my own Cholav Yisrael. And when I was down there, I supervised the milking, had wonderful goat's milk in my coffee. I don't second guess the Torah. I've studied it, I learned it. It's not really my warm, fuzzy feeling that's important. By way of illustration, I once I was supposed to mentor someone, and this guy said, I want to learn Talmud, but I want it to be meaningful to my life. And I said, well, I want my life to be meaningful to the Talmud. I guess it's really where you stand. If they don't want to waste it, I don't look at it as waste. So it's never been an issue. Once again, we elected not to boil before on Passover. I mean, it wasn't an election; we just wouldn't boil on Passover. And did we take a loss? No. I looked at the balance sheet at the end of the year. As a result of the Oprah thing, we made 10 times what we lost. Yeah. So it's not for me to say what's waste or what's thrown out. Yeah. That's the. I understand their position.
I don't know how or if it ever got resolved. I was just curious about all of that in general.
I assume that's something they need to work through. I'll be going to the Teva, learning. There's some way you may want to pop in if it has to do. In June, there's a Teva training seminar up at Surprise Light Camp, where they're training educators.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So they have me giving a seminar on composting. Notice they don't have me on the rabbinic track, and there are some rabbis who can turn compost into Torah, and whatever.
Compost into compost. All right. Well.